Well, good evening, everybody. We are back live. I can't tell you how frustrated I am with my internet provider and what's been going on this week, but we're here. We're ready to rock. I'm back in the old setup just because it's closer to our wireless router. And when hopefully we were hoping that the new router was going to come today and everything, and I was hoping I was going to stay out in the book nook, but we'll get back out there. So anyways, we got 34 pages to read to finish this book. I'm hoping that, we can make it through 17 or 18 tonight. We'll start cranking through it, and then we'll get to our news. So Jurgis had been at the Socialist gathering, right? And met that gentleman, Ostrinsky, who mended pants, right? That's what he did for a living. And uh-oh. You'll see the lights. They're not coming for me, not yet. Jurgis had slept on his kitchen floor after the meeting. That's where we left off. So Jurgis had breakfast with Ostrinsky and his family and then went home to Elizabeta. He was no longer shy about it. When he went in, instead of saying all the things he had been planning to say, he started to tell Elizabeta about the revolution. At first, she thought he was out of his mind. It was hours before she could really feel certain that he was himself. When, however, she had satisfied herself that he was sane upon all subjects except politics, she troubled herself no further about it. Jurgis was destined to find that Elizabeta's armor was absolutely impervious to socialism. Her soul had been baked hard in the fire of adversity, and there was no altering it now. Life to her was the hunt for daily bread, and ideas existed for her only as they pour upon that. All that interested her in regard to this new frenzy, which had seized hold of her son-in-law, was whether or not it had a tendency to make him sober and industrious. And when she found he intended to look for work and to contribute his share to the family fund, she gave him full rein to convince her of anything. A wonderfully wise little woman was Elizabeta. She could think as quickly as a hunted rabbit, and in half an hour she had chosen her life attitude to the socialist movement. She agreed in everything with Jurgis, except the need of paying his dues. And she would even go to a meeting with him now and then and sit and plan her next day's dinner amid the storm. For a week after he became a convert, Jurgis continued to wander about all day, looking for work until at last he met with a strange fortune. He was passing one of Chicago's innumerable small hotels, and after some hesitation, he concluded to go in. A man he took for the proprietor was standing in the lobby. He went up to him and tackled him for a job. "What can you do?" the man asked. "Anything, sir," said Jurgis. "I've been out of work for a long time." "Oh, I've been out of work for a long time, sir. I'm an honest man, and I'm strong and willing." The other was eyeing him narrowly. "Do you drink?" he asked. "No, sir." "Well, I've been employing a man as a porter, and he drinks. I've discharged him 7 times now, and I've about made up my mind that's enough." "Would you be a porter?" "Yes, sir. It's hard work. You'll have to clean the floors and wash spittoons and fill lamps and handle trucks." "I'm willing, sir." "All right. I'll pay you 30 a month and board, and you can begin now. If you feel like it, you can put on the other fellow's rig." And so Jurgis fell to work and toiled like a Trojan till night. Then he went and told Elizabeta, and also, late as it was, he paid a visit to Ostrinsky to tell him of his good fortune. Here he received a great surprise, for when he was describing the location of the hotel, Ostrinsky interrupted suddenly. "Not Hin's?" "Yes," said Jurgis, "that's the name." To which the other replied, "Then you've got the best boss in Chicago. He's a state organizer of our party and one of the best known speakers." So the next morning, Jurgis went to his employer and told him. The man seized him by the hand and shook it. "By Jove," he cried. I'm sorry. "By Jove," he cried. "That lets me out. I didn't sleep all night because I had discharged a good socialist." So after that, Jurgis was known to his boss as Comrade Jurgis, and in return, he was expected to call him Comrade Hinz. Tommy Hinz, as he was known to his intimates. He was a squat little man with broad shoulders and a florid face, decorated with gray side whiskers. He was the kindest-hearted man that ever lived, and the liveliest, inexhaustible in its enthusiasm, and talking socialism all day and all night. He was a great fellow to jolly around in a crowd, and would keep up in a meeting in an uproar. When once he got really waked up, and the torrent of his eloquence could be compared with nothing save Niagara. Tommy Hinz had begun life as a blacksmith's helper, and had run away to join the Union Army, where he had made his first acquaintance with graft in the shape of rotten muskets and shoddy blankets. To a musket that broke in a crisis, he always attributed the death of his only brother, and upon worthless blankets he blamed all the agonies of his old age. Whenever it rained, the rheumatism would get into his joints. Then he would screw up his face and mutter, "Capitalism, my boy, capitalism." He had one unfailing remedy for all the evils of the world, and he preached it to everyone, no matter whether the person's trouble was failure in business or dyspepsia or a quarrelsome mother-in-law. A twinkle would come into his eyes, and he would say, "You want to know what to do about it? What do you want to know what to do about it? Oh my goodness, vote the socialist ticket." Tommy Hinz had set out upon the trail of the octopus as soon as the war was over. He had gone into business and found himself in competition with the fortune of those who had been stealing while he had been fighting. The city government was in their hands, and the railroads were in league with them. And honest business was driven to the wall. And so Hinz had put all of his savings into Chicago real estate and set out single-handed to dam the river of graft. He had been a reform member of the city council, and he had been a greenbacker, a labor unionist, a populist, a Bryanite. And after 30 years of fighting, the year 1896 had served to convince him that the power of concentrated wealth could never be controlled, but could only be destroyed. He had published a pamphlet about it and set out to organize a party of his own, when a stray socialist leaflet had revealed to him that others had been ahead of him. Now for 8 years he had been fighting for the party, anywhere, everywhere, whether it was a GAR reunion or a hotel keepers convention or an African-American businessman's banquet or a Bible Society picnic. Tommy Hinz would manage to get himself invited and explain the relations of socialism to the subject in hand. After that, he would start off upon a tour of his town, ending at some place between New York and Oregon. And when he came back from there, he would go out to organize new locals for the state committee. And finally, he would come home to rest. And so socialism was in Chicago. Hinz Hotel was a very hotbed of propaganda. All the employees were partymen, and if they were not when they came, they were quite certain to be before they went away. The proprietor would get into a discussion with someone in the lobby, and as the conversation grew animated, others would gather about to listen, until finally everyone in place would be crowded into a group, and a regular debate would be underway. This went on every night. When Tommy Hinz was not there to do it, his clerk did it. And when his clerk was away campaigning, the assistant attended to it, while Mrs. Hinz sat behind the desk and did the work. The clerk was an old crony of the proprietor's, an awkward, raw-boned giant of a man with a lean, swallow face and a broad mouth, and whiskers under his chin, the very type of the body of a prairie farmer. He had been that all his life. He had fought the railroads in Kansas for 50 years, a Granger, a Farmers Alliance man, and a middle road populist. Finally, Tommy Hinz had revealed to him the wonderful idea of using the trust instead of destroying them, and he had sold his farm and come to Chicago. We talked about all that stuff in the last union. Holy cow, the Farmers Alliance, the Granger movement. Oh, oh my goodness, all these people out in the Midwest fighting the railroads, right? He said the octopus, the railroad stretching out all over the country and controlling it. All right. That was Amos Struver. And then there was Harry Adams, the assistant clerk, a pale, scholarly looking man who came from Massachusetts, of Pilgrim stock. Adams had been a cotton operative in Fall River, and the continued depression of the industry had worn him and his family out, and he had immigrated to South Carolina. In Massachusetts, the percentile of white illiteracy is 0.8%, while in South Carolina it is 13.6%. Also in South Carolina, there is a proper qualification for voters. And for these and other reasons, child labor is the rule. And so the cotton mills were driving those in Massachusetts out of the business. Adams did not know this. He only knew that the southern mills were running. But when he got there, he found that if he was to live, all of his family would have to work, and from 6 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning. So he had to set to work to organize the mill hands after the fashion of Massachusetts. And he had been discharged, but he had gotten other work and stuck at it. And at last there had been a strike for shorter hours, and Harry Adams had attempted to address a street meeting, which was the end of him. In the states of the far south, the labor of convicts is leased to contractors, and where there are no convicts, enough to have been supplied. Harry Adams was sent up by a judge who was a cousin of the mill owner, with whose business he had interfered. And though the life had nearly killed him, he had been wise enough not to murmur. And at the end of his term, he and his family had left the state of South Carolina, hell's backyard, as he called it. He had no money for car fare, but it was harvest time. And they walked one day and they worked the next. And so Adams got at last to Chicago, and he joined the Socialist Party. He was a studious man, reserved and nothing of an orator. But he always had a pile of books under his desk in the hotel, and articles from his pen were beginning to attract attention in the party press. Contrary to what would have been expected, all this radicalism did not hurt the hotel business. The radicals flocked to it, and the commercial travelers all found it diverting. Of late, also, the hotel had become a favorite stopping place for Western cattlemen. Now that the beef trust had adopted a trick of raising prices to induce enormous shipments of cattle, then dropping them again and scooping in all they needed, a stock raiser was very apt to find himself in Chicago without money enough to pay his freight bills. And so he had to go to a cheap hotel. And it was no drawback to him that there was an agitator talking in the lobby. These Western fellows were just meat for Tommy Hines. Excuse me, maybe it is Tommy Hines. I don't know. I think it's Hines. He would get a dozen of them around him and paint little pictures of the system. Of course, it was not a week before he had heard Jurgis' story, and after that he would not have let his new porter go for the world. See here, he would say in the middle of an argument, I've got a fellow right here in my place who worked there and seen every bit of it. Then Jurgis would drop his work, whatever it was, and come. And the other would say, Comrade Jurgis, just tell these gentlemen what you saw on the killing beds. At first, this request caused poor Jurgis the most acute agony. It was like pulling teeth to get him to talk. But gradually he found out what was wanted. And in the end, he learned to stand up and speak his piece with enthusiasm. His employer would sit by and encourage him with exclamations and shakes of the head. When Jurgis would give the formula of potted ham or tell about the condemned hogs that were dropped into the destructors at the top and immediately taken out again in the bottom to be shipped into another state and made into lard, Tommy Hines would bang his knee and cry, do you think a man could make up a thing like that out of his head? Let me have a sip and then I'll keep going. And then the hotel keeper would go on and show how the socialists had the only real remedy for such evils, how they alone meant business with the beef trust. And then In answer to this, the victim would say that the whole country was getting stirred up, that the newspapers were full of denunciations of it, and that the government taking action against it. Tommy Hins had an all knockout blow already. Yes, he would say, all that is true. But what do you suppose is the reason for it? Are you foolish enough to believe that it's done for the public? There are other trusts in the country just as illegal and extortionist as the beef trust. There is the coal trust that freezes the poor in winter. There's the steel trust that doubles the price of every nail in your shoes. There's the oil trust that keeps you from reading at night. And why do you suppose it is that all the fury of the press and the government is directed against the beef trust? And when to this, the victim would reply that there was clamor enough over the oil trust, the other would continue. 10 years ago, Henry D. Lloyd told all the truth about the Standard Oil Company in his Wealth versus Commonwealth, and the book was allowed to die, and you hardly ever hear of it. And now, at last, two magazines have the courage to tackle Standard Oil again, and what happens? The newspaper ridicules the authors. The churches defend the criminals, and the government does nothing. And now, why is it all so different with the beef trust? Here the other would generally admit that he was stuck, and Tommy Hins would explain to him, and it was fun to see his eyes open. If you were a socialist, the hotel keeper would say, you would understand that the power which really governs the United States today is the railroad trust. It's the railroad trust that runs your state government, wherever you live, and then runs the United States Senate. And all of the trusts that I have named are railroad trusts, save only the beef trust. The beef trust has defied the railroads. It's plundering them day by day through the private car. And so the public is roused to fury. And the papers clamor for action. And the government goes on the warpath. And you poor common people watch and applaud the job and think it's all done for you, and never dream that it's really grand climax of a century-long battle of commercial competition. The final death grapple between the chiefs of the beef trust and Standard Oil for the prize of the mastery of ownership of the United States of America. Such was the new home in which Jurgis lived and worked, and in which his education was completed. Perhaps you would imagine that he did not do much work there, but that would be a great mistake. He would have cut off one hand for Tommy Hins, and to keep Hins Hotel a thing of beauty was his joy in life. That he had a score of socialist arguments chasing through his brain in the meantime did not interfere with this. On the contrary, Jurgis scrubbed the spittoons and polished the banisters all the more vehemently because at the same time he was wrestling inwards with an imaginary wrestling inwards with an imaginary recalcitrant. It would be pleasant to record that he swore off drinking immediately, and all the rest of his bad habits with it, but that would be hardly exact. These revolutionists were not angels, they were men, and men who had come up from the social pit, and with the mire of it smeared over them. Some of them drank, and some of them swore, and some of them ate pie with their knives. There was only one difference between them and the rest of the populace, that they were men with a hope, with a cause to fight for and suffer for. There came times to Jurgis when the vision seemed far off and pale, and a glass of beer loomed large in comparison. But if the glass led to another glass and too many glasses, he had something to spur him into remorse and resolution on the morrow. It was so evidently a wicked thing to spend one's pennies for drink. When the working class was wandering in darkness and waiting to be delivered, and the price of a glass of beer would buy 50 copies of a leaflet, and one could hand these out to the unregenerate, and then get drunk upon the thought of the good that was being accomplished. That was the way the movement had been made, and it was the only way it would progress. It availed nothing to know of it without fighting for it. It was a thing for all, not for a few. A corollary of this proposition, of course, was to anyone who refused to receive the new gospel was personally responsible for keeping Jurgis from his heart's desire. And this, alas, made him uncomfortable as an acquaintance. He met some neighbors with whom Elizabetta had made friends in her neighborhood, and he set out to make socialists of them by wholesale. And several times he all but got into a fight. It was all so painfully obvious to Jurgis. It was so incomprehensible how a man could fail to see it. Here were all the opportunities of the country: the land, the buildings upon the land, the railroads, the mines, the factories, the stores, all in the hands of a few private individuals called capitalists, for whom the people were obliged to work for wages. The whole balance of what the people produced went to heap up the fortunes of these capitalists, to heap and heap again and yet again. And that in in spite of the fact that they and everyone about them lived in unthinkable luxury, and was not plain that if the people cut off the share of those who merely owned, the share of those who worked would be much greater. That was as plain as 2 and 2 makes 4. And it was the whole of it, absolutely the whole of it. And yet there were people who could not see it, who would argue about everything else in the world. They would tell you that government could not manage things as economically as private individuals. They would repeat and repeat that and think they were saying something. They could not see that economical management by masters meant simply that they, the people, were worked harder and ground closer and paid less. They were wage earners and servants, at the mercy of exploiters whose one thought was to get out as much of them as possible, and they were taking an interest in the process. They were anxious lest it should not be done thoroughly enough. Was it not honestly a trial to listen to an argument such as that? And yet there were things even worse. You could begin talking to some poor devil who had worked in one of the shops for the last 30 years. He had never been able to save a penny, who left home every morning at 6 o'clock to go and tend a machine, and come back at night too tired to take his clothes off, who had never had a week's vacation in his life, had never traveled, never had an adventure, never learned anything, never hoped anything. And when you started to tell him about socialism, he would sniff and say, "I'm not interested in that. I'm an individualist." Then he would go on and tell you that socialism was paternalism, and that if he ever had its way, the world would stop progressing. It wasn't enough to make a mule laugh, to hear arguments like that. And how many millions of such poor deluded wretches there were, whose lives had been so stunted by capitalism that they no longer knew what freedom was. And they really thought it was individualism, for tens of thousands of them to herd together and obey the orders of the steel magnate, and produce hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth for him. Then let him give them libraries, while for them to take the industry and run it to suit themselves and build their own libraries. That would have been paternalism. They're talking about Carnegie. Sometimes the agony of such things as it was almost more than Jurgis could bear. Yet there was no way to escape from it, and there was nothing to do but to dig away at the base of the mountain of ignorance and prejudice. You must keep at the poor fellow. You must hold your temper and argue with him and watch for your chance to stick an idea or two into his head. And the rest of the time you must sharpen up your weapons. You must think of new replies to his objections and provide yourself with new facts to prove to him the folly of his ways. So Jurgis acquired the reading habit. He would carry in his pocket a tract or a pamphlet which some other person had loaned him. Whenever he had an idle moment during the day, he would plod through a paragraph, then think about it while he worked. Also, he read the newspaper and asked questions about them. One of the other porter at Hinds was a sharp little Irishman who knew everything that Jurgis wanted to know. And while they were busy, he would explain to him the geography of America and its history, its constitution, and its laws. Also, he gave him an idea of the business systems of the country, the great railroads and corporations, and who owned them, and the labor unions, and the big strikes, and the men who had led them. Then at night, when he could get off, Jurgis would attend the socialist meetings. During the campaign, one was not dependent upon the street corner affairs, where the weather and the quality of the orator were equally uncertain. There were hall meetings every night, and one could hear speakers of national prominence. These discussed the political situation from every point of view, and all the trouble Jurgis was the impossibility of carrying off but a small part of the treasures they offered him. There was a man who was known to the party as the Little Giant. The Lord had used up so much material in making of his head that there had not been enough to complete his legs. But he got about the platform, and when he shook his raven whiskers, the pillar of capitalism rocked. He had written a veritable encyclopedia upon the subject, a book that was nearly as big as himself. And then there was a younger author who came from California and had been a salmon fisher, an oyster pirate, a longshoreman, a sailor who had tramped the country and had been set into jail, who had lived in the Whitechapel slums and been to the Klondike in search of gold. All these things he had pictured in his books, and because he was a man of genius, he forced the world to hear him. Now he was famous, but wherever he went, he still preached the gospel of the poor. And then there was the one who was known as the millionaire socialist. He had made a fortune in business and spent nearly all of it in building up a magazine, which the post office department had tried to suppress and had driven to Canada. He was a quiet-mannered man whom you would have taken for anything in the world but a socialist agitator. His speech was simple and informal. He could not understand why anyone could get excited about these things. It was a process of economic evolution, he said, and it exhibited laws and methods. Life was a struggle for existence, and the strong overcame the weak, and in turn were overcome by the strongest. Those who lost in the struggle were generally exterminated, but now and then they had been known to save themselves by combination, which was a new and higher kind of strength. It was so that the gregarious animals had overcome the predaceous. It was so in human history that people had mastered the kings. The workers were simply the citizens of industry, and the socialist movement was the expression of their will to survive. The inevitability of the revolution depended upon this fact, that they had no chance but to unite or to be exterminated. This fact, grim and exonerable, depended on no human will. It was the law of the economic process, of which the editor showed the details with the most marvelous precision. And later on came the evening of great meeting of the campaign, when Jurgis heard the two standard bearers of his party. 10 years before, there had been in Chicago a strike of 150,000 railroad employees, and thugs had been hired by the railroads to commit violence, and the President of the United States had sent in troops to break the strike by flinging the officers of the Union into jail without trial. The President of the Union came out of his cell a ruined man, but also he came out a socialist. And now, for just 10 years, he had been traveling up and down the country, standing face to face with the people and pleading with them for justice. He was a man of electric presence, tall and gaunt, with a face worn thin by struggle and suffering. The fury of outraged manhood gleamed in it, and the tears of suffering little children pleaded in his voice. When he spoke, he paced the stage, lithe and eager, like a panther. He leaned over, reaching out for his audience. He pointed to their souls with an insistent finger. His voice was husky from much speaking, but the great auditorium was as still as death, and everyone heard him. Whoa. And then, as Jurgis came out from this meeting, someone handed him a paper, which he carried home with him and read, and so he became acquainted with the appeal to reason. About 12 years previously, a Colorado real estate speculator had made up his mind that it was wrong to gamble in the necessities of life of human beings, and so he had retired and begun the publication of a socialist weekly. There had come a time when he had to set his own time, but he had held on and won out. And now his publication was an institution. It used a carload of paper every week, and the mail trains would be hours loading up at the depot of the little Kansas town. It was a 4-page weekly, which sold for less than half a cent a copy. Its regular subscription list was $250,000, and it went to every crossroads post office in America. The Appeal was a propaganda paper. It had a manner of its own, and it was full of ginger and spice, of Western slang and hustle. It collected news of the doings of the plutes and served it up for the benefit of the American working mule. It would have columns of the deadly parallel, the $1 million worth of diamonds, or the fancy pet poodle establishment of a society dame. Beside the fate of Miss Murphy of San Francisco, who had starved to death on the streets, or John Robinson, just out of the hospital, who had hanged himself in New York because he could not find work. It collected the stories of graft and the misery of the daily press, and made a little pungent paragraphs out of them. 3 banks in Bungtown, South Carolina failed, and more savings of workers swallowed up. The mayor of Sandy Creek, Oklahoma, has skipped with $100,000. That's the kind of rulers and old partyites give you. The president of Florida Flying Machine Company is in jail for bigamy. He was a prominent opponent of socialism, which he said would break up at home. An appeal, and the break up the appeal, He had what is called its army, about 30,000 of the faithful, who did things for it. And it was exhorting the army to keep its dander up and occasionally encourage it in a prize competition for anything from a gold watch to a private yacht or 80 acres of a farm. Its office helpers were all known to the army by quaint titles: Inky Ike, the bald-headed man, the red-headed girl, the bulldog, the office goat, and the one hoss. But sometimes, again, the appeal would be desperately serious. It sent a correspondent to Colorado and printed pages describing the overthrow of American institutions in the state. In a certain city of the country, it would hand over 40 to its army in the headquarters of the Telegraph Trust, and no message of importance to socialists ever went through a copy of it that did not go out to the appeal. It would print great broadsides during the campaign. One copy that came to Jurgis was a manifesto addressing the striking working men, of which nearly 1 million copies had been distributed in the industrial centers, wherever the employers' associations had been carrying out their open shop program. You have lost the strike, it was headed, and now what are you going to do about it? It was what is called incendiary appeal. And it was written by a man whose soul the iron had entered. When this edition appeared, 20,000 copies were sent into the Stockyards district, and they were taken out and stowed away in the rear of a little cigar store. I'll finish this page. And every evening and on Sundays, the members of Packingtown locals would get armfuls and distribute them on the streets and in the houses. The people of Packingtown had lost their strike, if ever a people had, and so they read papers gladly. 20,000 were hardly enough to go around. Jurgis had resolved not to go near his old house again, but then he heard of this, and it was too much for him. And every night for a week, he would get into the car and ride out to the stockyards and help to undo his work of the previous year, when he had sent Mike Scully's 10-pin setter to the city board of aldermen. It was quite marvelous to see what a difference 12 months had made in Packingtown. The eyes of the people were getting opened. The socialists were literally sweeping everything before them in that election, and Scully and the Cook County machine were at their wits' end for an issue. In the very close of the campaign, they bethought themselves of the fact that the strike had been broken by Negroes, and so they sent for a South Carolina fork eater and a pitchfork senator, as he was called, a man who took off his coat when he talked to the working man, and damned he swore like a Hessian. This meeting they advertised extensively, and the socialists advertised it too, with the result that about 1,000 of them were on hand that evening. The pitchfork senators stood their fusillade of questions for about an hour, and then went at home in disgust, and the balance of the meeting was a strictly party affair. Jurgis, who had insisted upon coming, had the time of his life that night. He danced about and waved his arms in excitement. And at the very end of the climax, he broke loose from some friends and got out into the aisle and proceeded to make a speech himself. The senator had been denying that the Democratic Party was corrupt. It was always the Republicans who had bought the votes, he said. And here was Jurgis shouting furiously, "It's a lie, it's a lie." After which he went on to tell them how he knew it, and that he knew it because he had bought them himself. And he would have told the pitchfork senator all his experiences had not Harry Adams and a friend grabbed him about the neck and shoved him into a seat. Bam. Chapter 31. We are there. And I think we're going to do this, my friends. We did 18 pages tonight. Whew. One chapter to go. What a great book, right? What a long, fun book this has been. Well, again, I want to apologize, my friends, about last night. The boys and I were watching Parks and Rec until about 10 minutes before we went live. We were supposed to go live. So I jumped on, I turned on the computer, and it had an update. Microsoft Windows update or whatever. So it did the update, blah, 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 blah. And then whatever it was, I don't know what the heck it was, it wouldn't let me on the interwebs. It wouldn't let me on YouTube. And I kept trying to sign on to Google Chrome and do my thing, and it was just not working. So anyways, here we are. We're going to finish this bad boy tomorrow. And we are going to start our new book, and I'm super excited. We'll start that new book on Sunday night. So, and I think we'll finish that book pretty quick. It's a good book. I think I literally may have read it in a weekend. When I read the first one, I honestly think I read the first one in a weekend. It's such a good book. And then the other 6, I took my time with it, but I read them pretty quick. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to do the news of the past 2 days, kind of going back and forth. So there have been more deaths. The deaths are not going down as quickly as we want them to. And today what I read is that the hospitalizations were actually up a little. They ticked up a little the past few days. But the real kind of interesting thing here, guys, is, and I think we talked about this Tuesday, is that there is this other COVID thing. They're calling it a COVID-related illness. And on Tuesday, there had been 100 cases in New York. 3 kids had died from it. And 14 states had reported this other illness. Well, now there's 110 in New York State. And 16 states have reported this other COVID-related illness. So when they tested these 110 kids, 60% of them had COVID, okay? They had COVID. They know that they had COVID. And here's what I think might be the scarier thing about all of this, is the other 40% had COVID. However, they had fought it off. So what does that mean? It means that there's no doubt that what they have is somehow related to the COVID illness. They've all been touched by it. So I guess the scary thing about this is that it's just kids. So, when this all started, it was infants and older people and people with diabetes and some stuff like that. Those seem to be the people that were they're most worried about, doctors were most worried about. And now, and they thought that, for the most part, your average kid, healthy kid was not so likely to get it. But now this other thing is springing up. And, I'm going to be honest with you. We got to keep an eye on that, because that to me is a little bit scary. So 3 more million people applied for unemployment this week. That brings it up to 36 million people total. And I guess that's bad news. And we're supposed to get a jobs report, I believe, tomorrow. But I guess the good news is that a lot of people across the state are going back to work tomorrow. So manufacturing jobs and construction jobs are opening up all over the state. So if you think about New York State, Capital District, New York City, Buffalo, nothing. Closed down still. But the rest of the state, so geographically, about 80% of the state is going to open up this way tomorrow. And I guess the capital region, they're saying, was there, out of these like 7 things that had to happen before you could reopen, the capital region had gone up to 6 out of 7, and then they ticked back to 5 out of 7. So it's close. But I guess the real question is, are people going to stay still? So meaning, now that other parts of the state are opening up, are people now going to venture to those parts of the state to do things that they want to do, therefore possibly carrying COVID with them? So, we'll see. I hope people are smart, and I hope people are still going to continue to socially distance. So, the stock market is not doing so hot the past few days, but it's not dropping anymore. But it's kind of doing this thing where it's like coming up, coming down, coming up, coming down, coming up, coming down, but it's just not coming up enough. So the House of Representatives are discussing another stimulus bill. And I guess that they are ready to vote on a bill. However, Mitch McConnell, who is the majority leader in the Senate, right? The House and the Senate have to pass a bill and then send it to the president to be law, to be signed into law. He is saying that, no, I'm going to wait until Memorial Day, which is, oh boy, let me see here. That's what? A week and it's a little less than 2 weeks away. So Memorial Day is the 25th. So he's saying, I'm not voting on anything until after then, which, I'm not going to lie to you. That might not be a horrible plan as long as they're using that time to really kind of flush it out, which I don't think in these last few bills they've really worked out everything they need to work out. And that's what, one of the things, there wasn't a lot of new news from the governor today. And that's, what he is continuing to harp on in his coronavirus briefings, is that New York State right now, at one point they were saying, well, we're looking at about a $14 billion shortfall. Then they were like, well, it's looking like it's about a $20 billion shortfall. Maybe it's more like 30. So now they're claiming that they're predicting that New York State is going to lose about $61 billion in revenue, which means that if we don't get money from the federal government, that there are going to be cuts. So hearing all of this, and actually, Schoharie County made it on the news. Schoharie County has furloughed 96 employees. So they said to these 96 employees, we're going to continue to pay into your retirement. We're going to still contribute into your healthcare plan. You're not going to lose your healthcare, but we can't pay you for 2.5 months. So that puts it to August, I guess. Yeah. Excuse me. I'm sorry, guys. So August. So they're not working until August. And most of these guys are, I guess, like that they're laying off, guys and gals, are like the people that are fixing potholes and working on, road construction and, like, oh, we need to put in a new culvert or something. And actually, that's what the guy was talking about on the news, is that, those things that, normally they spend most of the summer doing, getting things ready for, sorry, I think the cat knocked over part of the router again or something. Yeah, the wireless. So 96 workers, so the county's saying, okay, if we're going to be losing all this money, we need to make decisions. That's what government's there for. And if we're not going to have the money, well, we can't provide the services. We don't need these workers, so we need to lay them off. So that's that. Oh, excuse me. So the other thing that Governor Cuomo said is that one of the problems that he has with what the federal government is doing with a lot of the stimulus money is that, small businesses are getting money to keep paying their employees, but big businesses are, and these big businesses have laid off their employees and are not working them. And what we need to do is, if these bigger corporations, I mean, listen, businesses go into business to make money. But when some of these businesses are sitting on billions of dollars in profits, should they be getting stimulus money? I don't know. I'm not sure. And he's saying that, listen, if we're going to give these big corporations money, then they got to keep all their employees. They got to keep all their employees working. Which, you know what? Maybe that's a fair deal, right? Maybe that's like, yeah, maybe if these guys that are sitting on a couple billion in the bank, if they're going to get stimulus money, then you can't lay off anybody, and you've got to keep 100% of your workforce rolling. So that's what he's asking for. And I guess that, the governor wants to start bringing manufacturing and industry back to New York State in the form of, medical equipment and PPE and all that kind of stuff. He says, listen, we need this. This is our future. And, why don't we start making this stuff here so that if this happens again, we don't have to go to China. We don't have to beg other countries. We don't have to pull shady deals to get these things. Let's make them here, right? So, not bad. I don't know how much we need, but so this other House bill, I will talk about this a little bit, and then we'll get into this new day in history. So basically, they're talking about a $3 trillion spending stimulus bill. $3 trillion. $1 trillion would go to state and local governments. So New York, Schoharie, Rotterdam, Cobleskill, Syracuse, those money will go directly into those governments. $75 billion would go into corona testing. $175 billion would go to renters and homeowners. So meaning it's a lot of money. We're going to give renters and homeowners money to help them pay their mortgage and their rent. And I don't know, I think we've talked about this before. So right now, there's a $600 a week unemployment benefit. I thought originally it was $600 a month. It's not. It's $600 a week. And that runs out in July. And right now, if this bill passes, they're going to extend it to January. So, during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, pretty much, really lasted, I guess, up until about 2011, 12. You can be on unemployment for 99 weeks, and I think the maximum payout was like $575 a week. And that dropped significantly once the economy got better. It went down to like 24 weeks you could be on it. Now this is like super steroid, unemployment. And, you start out with $600 a week, and then you get more money on top of that. So they want to extend that and push that out to January. And there would be another round of stimulus checks. So there are a couple different plans. One plan was like one more big one-time payment. And I think it was kind of like if you got the $1,200 back in April, you would get $2,000 now. Then another plan was maybe we'll keep it at $1,200, and instead of getting it once, people would get it a couple times. So you might get like one in June, one in August, one in October, if it's still going on that long. So we'll see. It's a lot of money, guys. It's a lot of money to borrow. And I don't know what the right answer is. I really don't. But we'll see. So, when all this started, we talked about these 4 senators that had been, they had gotten real rich. They'd made a lot of money, 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat, because they had been in these coronavirus briefings back in January with the president. And what they did was they went and they sold stock that they knew would get hurt. And what they did is they bought stock in companies that they knew were going to do better. Well, one of these guys, Senator Richard Burr, has now, the FBI has now seized his, I guess, his personal phone and phone records. And they are investigating him, and they are going after him. So we shall see what comes of that. That's interesting. Okay, so last but not least, this day in history. This day in history. So on this day in history, May the 14th, 2020, 1787, the Constitutional Convention, our delegates from all of our, now states, former colonies, began to meet to discuss the problems with the Articles of Confederation and to discuss a new constitution to rule our country, which still to this day is in effect. On this day in 1804, Lewis and Clark begin their trip with the Corps of Discovery, right? The Louisiana Purchase is approved by the president and Congress, right? He convinces Congress to buy the land. And we now need to find that route to the Pacific. So Meriwether Lewis and I think it's is it William Clark? Geez, I should know the name. I believe it is William Clark. They head out to, and they do find they're gone for about 2.5 years. They go out, they get a route out to the Pacific, and then come back with awesome information for people to use and follow. On this day in 1914, the first ever American Olympiad takes place. It begins in St. Louis, Missouri. On this day in 1948, the State of Israel is created. So, you guys probably learned about the Balfour Declaration after World War One, and the English promising that a Jewish state would one day be created. And it's not until after World War II and the tragedy of the Holocaust that it really comes to fruition. But, the last place in the world that I think I would want to go visit at any given time is probably Israel, because it is just about one of the most violent countries in the world, and the countries that surround it. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that probably Israel has the most amount of terror attacks in its history. I don't know. I would assume. But people choose to live there because it's their homeland. All right, so on this day in 1955, we had talked this week in U.S. history about NATO. NATO was a deterrent, right? We want to stop, or we want to deter the Soviet Union from attacking us. How are we going to do that? We are going to do that by saying, hey, we've got this big, badass alliance that if you attack one member of this alliance, Soviet Union, well, you're going to get them all. Well, the Soviet Union did the same thing, right? The Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact on this day in 1955. And then I thought this was pretty cool. On this day in 1973, not long after I was born in 1973, best year ever, Skylab, which was the first United States space station, is launched into space on this day in 1973. So that's all I've got for you today, my friends. I am so excited that the interwebs worked tonight. I am so excited that we got to read together. I'm so excited that we got to share the news together. And I am so excited that tomorrow we finish with the jungle. And on Sunday, we begin I Am Number 4. It's tough to see with the shine. There it is. I Am Number 4 by Pittacus Lore. And I'll actually get to hold a book in my hand and read to you guys from now on, starting on Sunday. So there it is. Well, I hope you guys got outside today, because we got outside a lot. I went for a beautiful walk, great walk with Tig today, my little guy, and who's 6'3". And I mowed the lawn. We did a ton of yard work. We cleaned out some gutters. We cleaned up the barn. Did a little bit of raking, did a little bit of this, did a little bit of that. And we were just outside a lot today, which felt really, really good. And though tomorrow is supposed to be a very warm day, it's supposed to be like well into the 70s. Apparently, it's going to pour. So we were actually going to try to throw on our masks, and we were going to run to the local ice cream shop tonight, but it just looked like it was going to pour. So, and it's like an outdoor kind of thing. So we decided, we'll try again another night. But so we went and we got Stewart's ice cream. So no complaints with that. Stewart's puts on some good ice cream. So, but anyways, that's all I got for you tonight, guys. Again, I've said to you, I think every single night, we're just about keep running the marathon. Don't run the sprint. Hang in there. We're going to get there. The nice weather is going to be drawing us out. keep that mask on, keep socially distancing, stay smart, and we'll get through this. And tomorrow we'll finish up our second book. It's been a long book, right? Certainly a lot longer than April Morning, but a good book. And it's really one of those books that I think, it just shows so much about our nation's history, and it pulls in all of these great things, So, and I'm really happy that you guys have been there with me. So, anyways, I miss you guys. Be good. Run that marathon. Don't sprint. We will get there. We absolutely will. And I'll see you guys tomorrow night. Be good.